morning, everyone. I guess the mic does work. I guess I'm going to try and change this up a little bit. This is a conference about leadership in both law enforcement and corrections. Can I ask how many people are here from probation and parole, pretrial, juvenile corrections, or adult corrections? Could you just stand up for a minute? Thanks. I make the assumption then, those of you who did not stand up are from law enforcement, and that could be police, it could be prosecutor's office, it could be a variety of different things, the AG's office. And why I wanted to do that is I wasn't going to try and be pretentious today. I wanted to really share with those of us in the corrections field basically two major events that occurred in fiscal 10. And the major event was NIC, the National Institute of Corrections, basically had two groups. First group being the urban chiefs of probation, 20 of the largest county probation departments under the auspices of the American Probation and Parole Association come together and talk about, for the next 3 to 5 years in the 21st century, what did you as leaders see as the major emerging issues? Then they also had called together the Association of State Correction Administrators, which is much larger. And that group involves 50 states, all the largest prison systems, and almost 32 of the largest urban jails. And they all got together. And what I wanted to share with the audience is what we see as the emerging issues. And then I want to just talk about some of the similarities for those of us who work in the community, in probation and parole, and those that work inside corrections, whether it be a jail, a detention center, or a prison setting. And the amazing thing is there is a lot of overlap. I have this power. I know, isn't it impressive? Don't know where that came from, but let me just talk about the first group, which is the group I'm most identified with, which is probation and parole. They identified 12, there must be a line here, 12 issues for themselves. And we all tried to do the David Letterman thing, both the state correctional people and us. We wanted to come up with the top 10, but there was so much coming about that we actually came up with 12, and the actual document is much longer. And when you look at the first one, you will see that one of the things that we talked about is state and federal legislation, and there's a whole host of stuff that goes on with that. We needed to have a better voice in Washington, D.C. We needed to have a clearer voice in our state. And one of the things that we really wanted to talk about is something that Professor Griffin just talked about. What do we mean by evidence-based practice or evidence-based principles? And we wanted to really make sure that our colleagues in law enforcement in the criminal justice arena understood those particular things. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But there are many things that are coming down from Congress. You can talk about PREA, which is the Prisoners Rape Elimination Act, and how do we actually implement it. The idea that the Webb Commission may or may not exist in terms of where he may take it or not take it in terms of looking at true reform. So federal and state legislation is very critical. It also is going to be important for those of us that work in the community that we start engaging the other part. We've done a very good job in probation and parole, engaging local law enforcement and engaging county attorneys or district attorneys. We've not necessarily educated those individuals that work in the not-for-profit or advocacy arenas, for example, faith-based. We really need to engage them as partners, and you heard basically George talk about that and Scott talk about that. So federal and state legislation was the first that was identified. Secondly, specialty courts. Those of us that work in the court system, whether we be prosecutors, defense bar, or probation, or judges, they have grown by leaps and bounds, and they have done wonderful jobs on a small number of people. And the debate really is, how do you invest, should we invest, and does it make a difference? I can tell you they do make a difference, but we don't have enough people going through those particular court systems. So one of the things that we've really been talking about in probation and parole is how many specialty courts should we actually have? Which specialty courts give us the best outcomes? So that's going to be a big debate. And I know Bill Montgomery's in the audience, and we struggle with this one in our county also. which is where do we want to put our resources. And we have DUI court, we have drug court, we have veterans court, we have mental health court, we have transferred youth, and we have domestic violence. So we have a lot of specialty courts. Again, most of those have wonderful outcomes, but it's a lot of resources for less than 3,000 people that are affiliated with that. In Maricopa County alone, there are 54,000 people under jurisdiction. So that gives you an idea, and we have to really pay attention to the specialty courts. One of the other things that plays out with specialty courts is it depends on the fidelity of how you actually implement them. We can talk about specialty courts, but if you don't stay true to the program, you won't have the outcomes that you want. That was another big debate. Next is treatment programming. There's a whole host of issues. Believe it or not, I hate going back, and I'm not as old as George, and I'm not as old as Scott, which makes me feel good. And I'm probably older than you, Jeff. I was going to ignore you. But with treatment programming, we now know what does work. And we're real clear whether it's in the juvenile arena or the adult arena, we do know what works. And part of what we have to do is educate those of us in the probation and parole field not to interfere with treatment, but we also have to get our treatment providers to understand what the data actually shows. Holding on to old ways of doing business without really putting in cognitive behavioral programming is really going to be detrimental to what needs to be done. And yes, for my colleagues in law enforcement, sometimes I've heard people say, what could it hurt? Well, what the research now tells us, if we put the wrong people into treatment, they actually will get worse. The same thing happens in the level of supervision. If we put low-risk defendants on high-risk issues, they actually get worse. And you may ask yourself, why is that? Well, the research pretty much says you're taking someone who has a little bit more pro-social means and perhaps more people in the community who are supportive of pro-social, and you're throwing them in with the antisocial. Guess what they'll pick up? It's sort of, if you think of yourselves as parents, you have some principal things that you really always want to ask your children. Who are you hanging with? When they start to hang with a more difficult group, you want them to go back to the group that is a little bit easier. So the treatment programming becomes really major. You see underneath that budget cuts. We in this state, not unlike lots of other states, are in an enormous fiscal crisis. And one of the programs that consistently gets cut is how do we provide services for those who have needs. We know we've just taken some big cuts in access. There will be some unintended consequences to that. It will make our life in trying to really work with people in the community, whether it be in the parole field, juvenile or adult, if we don't have that access to services for the population Scott talked about, 18 to 29, and unfortunately they're mostly going to be males, and they will not have children, they will not get services. So it's going to become really critical that we try and figure out how to assist and how to get people to understand not only do you need the supervision side of it, but you need the treatment side so that you can actually respond to criminogenic needs. The other major one is, and I don't think this is going to surprise anybody in the audience, do we have anybody that works on the crisis intervention teams here from the police? Okay. Our systems have taken over the responsibility for the mentally ill, the seriously mentally ill, who do some dumb things and who do some very dangerous things in our community. When you look at the jails, when you look at who's in prison, when you look at who is on probation and who is on parole, whether it be juvenile or adult, there is a growing number of people who have mental health needs. That particular one is going to be a major struggle, and it really is very interesting. Remember I said this is 20 jurisdictions. When we did this presentation to 150 APPA board of directors, this was the one that 150 people said this is the #1 problem that we're going to be confronted with, and it's an ever-growing number of individuals. So mental health becomes a very big one. How do you manage people in the communities when you also have your treatment programming being cut? Surprise, housing sex offenders in our community. This is one that no one wants to talk about, but most sex offenders do come back home to our neighborhoods. And there are many different laws that have been imposed about restrictions to residencies across the United States. And I can tell you this is probably a very small number of people that we work with, but it is the most difficult population to actually find an adequate housing for them. Now, I can tell you, and I think any of the police officers that are in this audience will say the same thing, when you have a sex offender living under the 7th Avenue Bridge, it's a disaster waiting to happen. It would be far better if we could find appropriate housing, know where they are at all times, because you know one of the problems with what I just described? Almost all of them, if they're on probation, also have global positioning systems, and we're actually having them come to the office, plug in, so they can upload their batteries and go back out into the streets. It's really quite scary on what could actually happen. This is one of those populations that a lot of people think that everyone remains locked up, and unfortunately, almost all of them come home. And the reality is there's no home to go, and we really need to look at some of the residence restriction requirements. There may be better ways to handle it through technology if people are coming home. But we actually have programs that have been set up in a variety of different states. And you can go to the smallest state, and I'm probably going to be wrong on this, but it's either North or South Dakota. They actually have trailers that have been set up in jails and on the prison where sex offenders live, even though they're no longer in the prison system or the jailing system. So that's going to be a major one for us to confront. Domestic violence. The research that my colleagues talked about is that we really don't have any clear indication that batterer programs work. But what we do have from the research is safety and working with victims to ensure they're no longer being battered actually has worked. And it's a struggle. We continue wanting to try and figure out what would change a person's behavior in terms of their battering. And we don't have that answer yet. They're still struggling. We have lots of programs out there. They have better than chance results. So my colleagues are really looking to a variety of different places, working with either SAMHSA and NIDA to attempt to try and deal with this particular issue, because one of the major criminogenic pieces here is alcohol and substance abuse. The trigger seems to be when people go back to that, it's very easy to batter. So that is another major issue. The other I wanted to just throw out is people have gotten crazy with global positioning systems. It's a tool. It's a very good tool, but a person can easily just cut it off, and then we have to kind of scramble and do the old-fashioned police work and probation work together and find them. GPS could be utilized for domestic violence victims. It's called reverse GPS. You actually have a restriction or an order of protection that says someone can't come in front of you for 500 feet. You set up the zones so that the woman or the man that is the victim actually has the ability to know them and that person penetrates their space. Then there's a safety plan in place and they can get to a safe haven. We don't have a lot of programs like that because we're tracking sex offenders. And I would just kind of posit to everybody out there, this would be a better use of technology. And the reason for that is if a person has an order of protection and someone violates that, if they're on probation or parole, you actually have something that is very chargeable, and you can bring them in and have them violated for their probation condition that basically said you cannot go within that kind of feet. So that is another use. I was really glad to hear Scott in his introduction talk about technology. One of the things that happens with technology, anybody have an idea of how many probation organizations there are nationally? Anybody want to take a guess? I don't have a prize. There are over 50,000 because most probation is done locally. And that's one of the amazing pieces that comes out of this. And don't quote me because it'll probably turn out to be 42,742, but it's almost 50,000 because it's all county-based. And there's states like Kansas that have 3 different probation systems. So it's very, very interesting. Technology doesn't necessarily get to probation. We're very envious of our colleagues in any one of the local police departments in looking at what is in patrol cars, what's available to an officer as they actually are able to go to a particular place. We are catching up, but technology is something that really is going to be critical for probation departments and parole departments. If we are to be a real viable partner with law enforcement, you want our information. You would be amazed, and I know I ran into a couple of different people from Tempe and from Phoenix. We constantly are giving data feeds every week to you. You have a lot of information on the people who are under our care. By and large, You're working with us on investigations. We are working with you on our Fugitive Apprehension Task Force, and we're using that information. So technology is going to be something that we really need to be thinking about. And the reason for that, as you heard George talk about ComStat, you're going to hear when I get to the local level, as I move down from this national level, how we need to be data-driven. If we're going to have only limited resources, we have to make our decisions based on data, and we need to be able to use that data in a way that makes some semblance of sense. And the only way you're going to get that is by having good technology information systems. The next piece that the urban chiefs talked about was officer safety, a major debate in the probation and parole field. We, by and large, are not armed. There is an option to be armed. Now, I came from New York State, and New York State Division of Parole was an armed organization. It was required. But here in Arizona, it's only recently, only 6 years ago, that we have the ability to have the option to be armed. Safety is a major criticism of the chiefs of probation and parole organizations. And the reason for that is, by and large, a lot of the organizations are what we would refer to as fortress probation. We're not out in the community. My department and other departments are in the community. And if we're in the community and we're working with police, we need to have the same tools that police officers have. We need to be perhaps a little bit more discreet in how we actually use those tools, because we're going in and out of people's homes who have done nothing. Only their son or their daughter, perhaps, or their loved one has done something. So this debate at the probation and parole level is amazing. But more and more people are moving and looking at redesigning offices. And the reason for that is, if you think about, and let's just use Maricopa, but you could pick any one of the other counties, I was always happy initially if I got a storefront. My God, I'm able to have a new office building and I'm in a storefront. Unfortunately, a number of years ago, we had an incident. It was very serious, and it involved the shooting in our Scottsdale office. And all of a sudden, I had a wake-up call. You know, being happy that the county has given me X amount of dollars to get into a storefront was not the right thing to do. My executive team stepped a couple steps back and said, we really need a whole redesign, and we need to make our officers safer, and for the police officers who are coming in to do the arrests. Every one of our buildings, and there are 15 buildings, have been retrofitted and actually have been set up so that there's less movement of defendants. We have arrest rooms. So the profession is struggling with how does it actually ensure safety of its staff, something that we really did not think of long ago. The other is, with some of the incidents that have happened nationally, we're not a part of the officer study that is done at the national level, and we don't necessarily have the same rights when we lose a man or a woman in the field. No one's keeping track nationally of what happens to probation and parole officers in terms of injury. I'm happy to say that APPA is working with the Bureau, the FBI, and also BJA, Bureau of Justice Assistance, to try and set up at least some way to categorize injuries to probation and parole. With that also comes the need to make sure that we have critical stress teams out there and available to the various places. So it's a very new demand that's been placed on probation and parole departments that people have not necessarily seen in the past. Oh, we got a clicker. Thanks. The next one really is something that they labeled Realignment Efforts. And this realignment is really trying to look at a variety of different things. And this could be a debate, but more and more people are talking about trying to front load the system and move people into appropriate care and appropriate levels of supervision and have more success. So realigning some of the dollars and really investing in diversion programs, investing in CITs, investing in probation, and trying to be more successful. One of the things that we need to do from the probation and parole field is also to educate our partners on what we're attempting to do. 30 years of research has told us what works. And by saying what works, I think what's important to understand is it is a belief from the probation and parole field that one of the ways, and perhaps the fundamental way, because 98% of the people come home. They come back to our communities, whether it's from jail or it's from prison. 98% come home. The question is, do they come home healthier, or do they come home meaner and leaner and madder and whatever? And the reality is, we really don't know. We do know that both corrections and parole and probation are moving in a direction that says we know how we can promote public safety by changing behavior, one person at a time, because that's what our job is, attempting to change behavior. And that also means change the way people think. These 8 principles are really important, and I'll show you a slide a little later on what they are. Now, it's great to talk that we know what works in terms of the 8 principles, and if you apply them, you should have tremendous results. The problem is you have to have fidelity to those 8 principles. You can't just do and say you're going to do a risk assessment. You've got to make sure if you're using a particular risk assessment, you have some type of quality assurance that everybody's interpreting and everybody's questioning and everybody's measuring. So fidelity to those things is very critical. That's not the responsibility of local law enforcement, of prosecutors, of the court. That is the responsibility of our field, community corrections. It's important that we make sure, if we're going to talk about evidence-based practice, that we ensure that we're actually doing it. The next one is something that I think everybody in the audience can imagine. The chief said for the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to be looking at lousy fiscal times. And budget cuts was on everybody's mind. We had a whole, that was almost a 2.5-hour discussion about what do you do with it? How do you deal with it? What could it actually mean? And one of the things that came out of that is if we're going to be doing evidence-based practice and we're going to be data-driven, then we have to look at sacred cows. If a program isn't working, just because it may be the presiding judge's favorite program, for those of us who work in the court, we may have to go to that presiding judge and lay out all the statistics and say, this isn't having the results. You might be able to reinvest this money in a more viable way. Those that work for governors, the same deal. Those that work for common councils, it would be the same type of thing. So people really talked about budget cuts. And some of the things that's really interesting with the budget cuts, in tough times, good leaders have to make tough decisions. And one of the things that was very interesting in working with the other individuals is listening to how everybody used data to make those decisions. We did not talk about stories. We didn't try and protect old guard. We basically said this is a program that doesn't appear to be working, and we think we can reinvest in a different way, and people did just that. Of course now. Up. Now, what are these 8 principles? Well, I think what's really important, and this is from the National Institute of Corrections, for those of us that work with offenders, and I would think that most of the police officers and district attorneys or county attorneys in the room, hopefully you understand that's what our job is. Our job is to change behavior. Then we'll get public safety. It would be so much easier if I was able to take out my magic wand and change everybody's way of thinking, who they are hanging with, and what they were dealing, but it doesn't work that way. One of the things that we found out through the research, and it doesn't matter adult or juvenile, we have limited resources. We have to make sure we're investing those resources on the most high-risk individuals. Spend a little less time with the moderates, and spend hardly any time with those low-risk defendants. So you need the appropriate risk assessment tool that's validated and that's implemented and has fidelity so that you can sort appropriately. In Maricopa County, we have something that's called the offender screening tool. It is a statewide tool used by every single probation department on the adult side to sort people. And that sorting process pretty much says, when we tell you this is a high-risk probationer, that means 1 out of 2 are going to fail. When we talk about a low-risk person, 1 out of 10 is going to fail. Now, for every police chief that may be here or deputy chief, where would you invest? Would you go find the 1 out of 10, or would you just go ahead and put all your resources in the 1 out of 2? Does it make sense? So we are now looking at across the United States, and there's a variety of different tools. There's no one good tool. There's a variety of tools that work that will sort individuals. And in that sort, there are dimensions that tell us what we need to attack. And some of those things are kind of counterintuitive. Most people don't necessarily know that it's not going to be the number one thing that we need to deal with is drugs and alcohol, or that they don't have a job. Anybody have any ideas of what we need to be addressing? Antisocial thinking. Does that make sense? You got a person in front of you, they're not thinking the right way. If you don't start to change that, what's going to happen? It doesn't matter that they're doing drugs or if they're holding a job, if they're thinking the wrong way. How about who they hang with? John, you if you think about it, if I have the wrong, I'm not pro-social thinking, I'm anti-social thinking, I'm hanging with the wrong group of people, what am I going to probably do? Part of what our job is going to be is to get people to think differently, to let go of bad friends, move them to pro-social ways of doing that. Now, you heard that I have over 30 years in the business. I am Irish, I am optimistic, and I'm the first generation to go through college. Now, why did I just say all that to all of you? You must have hope. If you do not believe that people can change, then I'm not sure what we do in this business. I have watched officers, I have watched treatment providers, I have watched police officers make a huge difference in people's lives by affording them some hope. So, I believe very strongly, and I'm very passionate about what we do, that we can change behavior. But I'm also from New York. I'm in here a long time, or at least I think a long time, over 15 years. So I'm a little cynical. I actually know that not everyone can change, and I'd like to find those that don't want to play in the sandbox nice and send them back. So I have no fear of doing that. The next kind of principles all really start with that offender sorting. It talks about enhancing motivation so that people will change, targeting the right people. Do not put low-risk people in with high-risk individuals. It's going to not work. Be responsive. Surprise, surprise, women are different than men. If they're in a treatment group, especially a substance abuse one, it's not going to work if you have a co-ed right away. Separate them out. Be responsive to the female needs. When you're addressing cognitive behavioral functioning, cognitive is just our way of thinking. You heard Clay talk about the antisocial thinking. We've got to change the way in which people think, and you can. This is very successful. There are a lot of different programs that are out there that assist that. Now, for years, I thought I could really punish a person or sanction a person, and I could do a lot of things with that individual, and they would change. Guess what? I was dead wrong. Dead wrong. And if you think about it, just think about yourself. Do you do a lot of things willingly and happily if you've been punished? If you've been criticized, perhaps chastised? The reality is no. But when you're recognized for good work, when you're actually praised, you feel a little bit better about yourself and you move a little bit, you're more willing to listen. So this has been very counterintuitive and very hard for those of us that have been in the field for a long time and are used to being the sanctioning people, that we actually had to take some time and tell people you're doing well and give them incentives to continue to do well. I've been criticized, as along with some of my colleagues, that we actually give out zoo tickets to some people who have remained crime-free, drug-free, and are proceeding with their case plan for 6 months so they can take their family to the Phoenix Zoo. You have no idea what that does to a father or a mother that can finally do something like that. These are people who've never been told something positive in a lot of their lives. So I'm up here to tell you one of the things that you're going to hear probation and parole doing a lot more is attempting to do positive reinforcement. Surprise, you go back 30 years, you think Skinner, you're going to understand some of this. Provide ongoing support. Ongoing support. We used to, in probation and parole, always just say it's the officer to the offender. All of a sudden we realized, you know what, there's natural communities out there that actually can assist us to do this job better. And those natural communities are whoever in their life is pro-social. We actually had an employer spend a lot of time with an individual, and he came to a series of graduations with this guy on probation. That meant the world to that probationer. But you know what it meant to my department? We actually have this employer now employing more people because he had a positive experience with it. Finding that natural community that will be supportive of people is critical. Measure outcomes. You're going to hear me talk a lot about this. I am completely data-driven. And being able to know what you are trying to do and measuring it is critical. And that's a very big difference in the field. On the side, you see providing quality assurance. That's the word I talked to you about, fidelity. Those are the 8 principles. That is what the profession, at least in parole and probation, are attempting to do. National Institute of Corrections, there's a whole series of research behind that. You can get on the University of Cincinnati. They have a huge one. You can go over to California. You can just Google evidence-based practice, and a whole host of criminal justice schools will have evidence-based practice now a part of it. Turning to my colleagues that work in the institutions, and you're going to see 14 items here, and 5 of them will be similar to what the probation and parole people were dealing with, but they're uniquely different. If I can do a shorthand, the institutional corrections people, whether it be detention centers, whether it be jail, or whether it be prison, really are in the business to have and to hold humanely. And so you're going to see some different things up, and I know Director Ryan Flanagan are here, and they can talk a little bit about this. But one of the critical incidents that occurred nationally was around the Interstate Compact. And this was really involving the state of California, Oregon, and Washington, but there have been a series of ones between New York, Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And this is where people don't abide by the Interstate Compact. And yes, there is an Interstate Compact on how we move inmates, how we move juveniles, how we move adult probation and parole, and states have a right to refuse. When people, whether it be a judge, whether it be a probation or parole person, or whether it be a corrections person, basically says, go ahead, go to some place, yes, you're from LA, and we'll just pretend that we know where you are. This Interstate Compact has become very critical, that all states really abide by it, that all agencies abide by it. Unfortunately, in Washington, there were a number of police officers who were killed, and in that particular incident, it was federal probation, it was California parole, and it was also basically the state of Washington's correction system. No one had any idea where this individual was. So top on the agenda of state corrections people is this Interstate Compact piece. The other is that they've been talking about cost cutting, and this is a struggle for the prison system. And the struggle here is they actually, how do you do staff furloughs when you're running a 24/7, and can you really do that with badged or with detention officers or correctional officers? So most people are doing it with civilians, and then the problem with civilians, it could be their medical, and they need 24/7 medical. They may need 24/7 food, laundry, and it becomes very critical in terms of if they have to take, and the amazing thing in doing this research and looking at how many states actually are basically furloughing people out of the Department of Corrections, mostly civilians, but 15 states are actually doing correctional officers, which kind of caught me by surprise, because you know what happens? Other correctional officers get overtime to cover. So it turns out that it's probably not a cost savings device. It's actually an increase because of what has been playing out. Transgender inmates. Well, we're in the community. That issue doesn't become one because it's a community issue. It becomes a major one when you're trying to figure out how to house. Do you go on with medical procedures? Where are they in that process? And you're going to hear me talk a little bit about how much medical cost is actually driving some of the things that our colleagues in institutional corrections are facing. An issue here, they talk about whether or not to give one drug for another drug. Now, we do it all the time, for the seriously mentally ill. There's a lot of research that does talk about you can diminish people's cravings, particularly around narcotics and opioids, and should corrections actually do that? Is that viable or not viable? So they're struggling with that particular piece. Inmates working in the community, twofold here. There are wonderful programs with people who are working in the community, who are doing very viable kinds of things. Think about our state. Some of the major firefighting that has gone on has actually been done with inmates coming in and cutting. And some of those programs are being cut because they're staffed by people who are not necessarily detention officers or correctional officers. So the local municipalities are winding up having to pick up programs that formerly were done by inmates. So it gets a little tricky. The other is who should be outside the walls working in the community. So it's twofold in terms of what they identified. The cost of health care. This was the #1 issue that they really talked about. It's a driving force. And part of it is when I go to the next slide, I think. No, it's later on. There is an aging or a graying of inmates within the institution. But more importantly, people coming in, because of the level of drug use and other health issues in our communities, from the communities that they're coming, enormous medical problems, problems that corrections has never faced before. Again, because I work in the community, that person is to access urgent care and other things, but constitutionally, we have to provide medical care. Huge discussion on the part of institutional corrections. Surprise, here's one of the similarities. Housing of sex offenders. They too are finding that it's next to impossible to place individuals once released. Sentencing reform, similar to the state and federal legislation I talked about from the community corrections or probation and parole. Here you basically see them talking about 3 strikes laws, the lengthening of people that are actually going into state prisons. They're also talking about could there be some type of sentencing reform that needs to be done. So sentencing reform is big on the minds of my colleagues in the institutions. Another concern is privatization. We have that debate going on here. In fact, one of the best studies that's ever come out on cost and comparison of private prisons and the actual effectiveness of a state prison system is out of Arizona. And Charles Ryan, Director Ryan, they were just in the New York Times 2 days ago talking about this particular issue. And the study clearly shows that private prisons are not any less expensive. In fact, they're maybe creaming the crop, so they're not taking medical. They're taking basically minimum and low-risk individuals. So the debate here is around the effectiveness of a state-run system or a county-run system versus privatization. Where most people have gone on this is they've privatized the mental health and the correctional health, but not necessarily the actual running of state prisons. From my understanding and talking to a variety of different people who are part of this association, the bigger concern, and this shouldn't surprise a lot of people in the room, is the lobbying effort that's going on with a lot of these corporations. They're lobbying the state administrators' bosses. So you're talking the legislature or you're talking the governor, and they're not necessarily notifying the state corrections, because some state corrections people have a very strong sense that this isn't the right way to go. But you can end run people, as we all know, and that has been occurring here. You heard me talk about the Webb Commission. It's the National Criminal Justice Commission Act of 2011. Senator Webb is not running for re-election. He is a senator from Virginia. I don't think this will be going anywhere. It is a very interesting set of legislation that would really truly look at how the feds are funding local law enforcement and police. I mentioned earlier the Prison Rape Elimination Act. This has tremendous ramifications for institution, and that includes juvenile detention facilities. It has impact on community corrections, but not as great. Aging, I mentioned that. Here we go, the mentally ill in prison, the same problem you saw the probation and parole people talking about, and budget cuts, another major influence that's both in the community side and the institutional side. Now, that's what the leaders across the United States have identified as what they'll be confronted with the next 3 to 5 years. Anything not up there that surprises you? Immigration. And undocumented. I think the reason for that, and I have to be very honest, the border states were all there. Most of us in community corrections and corrections feel that they have good and or have developed good working relationships with ICE. It's not impossible. We're not necessarily pleased with the way in which the feds are handling how we get reimbursed for certain things. But most of the people who were there are all states that were in favor of secured communities and are working well. So I think that's why it isn't up there in terms of a correction side. And so that's just my guess. Anything else? Okay. Now, what I was asked to do is to give you, from a correctional leadership perspective, what do we think the trends were and the emerging issues. That's what we believe they will be. But we didn't try and go all the way through the 21st century. We basically set ourselves 3 to 5, and that's what you're going to see organizations really dealing with. Now I want to try and turn it and ask a question in terms of, well, what does the general public see? And you heard mentioned earlier by Scott, the Pew Center for States. Pew has been doing a lot of different studies. You heard Scott and George talk about reentry. You might have heard things like reinvestment. Maybe you've heard about Project Hope, the Hawaii program, which is swift and certain sanctions. I'm going to share with you a recent study that was done with voters across the United States, and it really is something that Pew is attempting to have a discussion with voters in terms of where would you put your dollars and why. And then I'm going to get to what's going on at a local level. So I'm trying to do, here's what we think will happen the next 3 to 5 years, institution and in the community, then take us to what does the voters or the public think about particular parts of this. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I believe my leadership style is and how it's changed over the years, and share with you basically a scaling device that talks about organizational development. Now, this is Pew Center for States, but Pew doesn't have necessarily the resources, back up. They have the resources, they don't have the experience. They contracted with 2 major organizations. One is called Public Opinion Strategies, and the other is the Benson Strategy Group. And basically, they are the ones that are used by either Republican or Democrat polling authorities across the United States to get a sense, what are the voters, what are the citizens thinking, and why? And they did this in 2010, so I'm trying to stay current so that you get a sense of, here's correctional leadership, here's what the public is thinking. They surveyed 1,200 individuals, landlines and cell phones, and they asked a variety of questions, the demographics of what people look like, which is kind of fascinating, that the people they called, 20% were either a victim of some type of violent crime or their member of their family was. 48%, almost half of the citizens they contacted were involved in some type of non-violent crime. 17% of us, because law enforcement was considered a whole host of different things, were surveyed. 43% said they identified themselves as conservative. I think it was 20% identified themselves as liberal. I could have put up more. It's a random, it's across the United States, and it fits in terms of all the various regions and ethnicities. Now, a couple of things that they really wanted to talk about. The people that they surveyed basically said that they want their community safe, first and foremost. I don't think that's going to surprise a person in the room, that people want to be safe. One of the things that was kind of interesting is they wanted bad guys, criminals, to be held accountable for their illegal activity. And they do believe that we make a difference. So I think part of this is that third piece is they don't necessarily see that you have to jail everybody. And that's going to be a little bit of a theme you're going to hear from me, that we don't have to jail everybody if we listen to the public. And sometimes I think the public is out in front of our legislators and some of us in policy-making arenas. Now, they were asked questions about where do they think you can reduce prison time? And could you reduce prison time by basically moving low-risk defendants or criminals out and making sure that violent people stayed in? First column talks about strongly agree. The next is how many people totally agree. So it's amazing that in both, they felt very strongly in favor that you could move people out if they were truly low-risk individuals and place them in and hold them more accountable in some other fashion. Again, people wanted to make sure there's punishment, but they don't necessarily think that we have to be incarcerating, and we certainly don't have to necessarily incarcerate people for as long as we're incarcerating people. Again, this is something that I know the Department of Corrections, I know Governor Brewer, I know across the United States are really trying to deal with how much cost savings could you have if you would change up some of the months that an individual, or days if you're working in a jail system. And as you can see, look at that note. They basically said, in terms of whether or not a person's in for 21 months, 24, or 27, did they really think what matters is when the person is released or when they go out, what they're actually released to? 75% said the other matters. 91% totally agree. But that's strongly agree. 3 out of 4 Americans are basically saying, you could change this up a bit. Now, same type of thing. Looking at keep the bad guys in, and we don't care how long you keep the bad guys in. Now, I'm paraphrasing there. But when you look, do you believe that probation and parole needs to be stronger and more viable? The public again says yes. When you look at how people are resourced, probation and parole, of all the partners within the justice system, is the least resourced, whether that be technology, staff, equipment, appropriate treatment dollars. So what you see is a conversation starting to emerge that perhaps somehow to reinvest some of those dollars into a more viable probation and parole system. Again, a way to do that, whether it's juvenile or adult, would basically not be wasting services on low-risk individuals and really targeting those high-risk individuals and medium high-risk individuals so that we could make a difference in their lives. Again, people are talking about stronger and more viable probation and parole. Now that might seem a little self-serving for the president of the American Probation and Parole Association, the chief adult probation officer here in Maricopa, but one of the things I wanted to do is, this wasn't conducted by Maricopa. This wasn't done by APPA, which is the acronym for that particular organization. It wasn't done for the Correctional Administration. It was done by a nonpartisan group of individuals who are attempting to get a sense of what does the public think. Again, something that we used to always kind of be an afterthought. I know a lot of people just think that probation or parole, because it doesn't involve necessarily jail or prison, is just a slap on the wrist. And I can tell you there are a lot of offender studies that basically have said, and I know I have some prosecutors in the room, a lot of people reject probation after they've gone through because probation's too hard. It's easy to do, even Tent City here in Maricopa. Sheriff doesn't like when I say that, but when I ask him the question, is it true? He unfortunately looks down and says yes. So the public is willing to invest in probation and parole, making it mandatory, mandatory supervision, mandatory drug testing, doing GPS where it's appropriate. Now, question here is, I don't want to make any enemies in the room. I have wonderful working relationships with most of the folks in the room. Remember, this is Pew, not Barbara. But there is some interesting things in terms of what people would like to see. And in fact, Arizona was at the forefront. A number of years ago, we basically did the Safe Communities Act that talked about reinvesting If probation was more successful by having less technical violators going to the Department of Corrections, for every dollar saved, remember it's just really cost avoidance to the department, it's really not real money, 40 cents was going to come to the local communities. Unfortunately, that was voided this legislative session, given our budget climate. But the interesting thing is, even though we knew no money was coming, probation and the Department of Corrections embraced on a journey to basically look, could we make a difference, and what would that difference really look like? And I believe you can do it with reinvesting some of the dollars in better fiscal times, when we're not all in competition for the same type of dollar, but to think a little bit smarter on where we want that investment to be, because there's not a person in this room that doesn't want our community to be safer. And I think sometimes we're losing sight of those individuals. I'm going to say it again, 98%, wherever we send them, are coming home. And the question is, can we do a better job preparing them to be more pro-social, to make them want to be a part of society rather than what they've been a part of for a very long time. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is where I don't want to make enemies. And when they ask the voters, what do you want and how would you want to take cuts? They don't want to cut K through 12. They don't want to cut, or they don't want their property taxes to rise. They really don't want to see reductions in health care, higher ed, that must make ASU feel good, business taxes, state prison. Let's go after those wealthy people and funding for transportation projects. Another way to look at it is they're willing to cut roads. They're willing to cut the tax advantages that the wealthy have, and they are willing to cut corrections over education. Now, having said that, there's still institutions to be run 24/7, and it's very difficult to cut there. But it is interesting that the citizens are willing and rated that way. Again, when you start looking at the reinvestment dollars, you can clearly see that people want to go to the front end of the system. And to some degree, it's probably very biblical when you think about it. We're talking about wanting to prevent crime. We want to see what's upstream rather than just always just warehousing individuals, and really stopping what has been going on in our neighborhoods. And it really is just reinvesting in our neighborhoods. Forget where does it actually go. But it's amazing how strongly they favor that no matter which way you kind of ask that question. Now, that's the big, way up top picture. How does that apply to someone like myself? That's my national presence with my colleagues, both in the institutional side and in the community. So what have we done here in Maricopa County? Well, I'm going to talk now a little bit about correctional leadership. And this doesn't come out of a book. This is what I believe my staff has asked me to become. And I say that because we've done some rigorous looks at ourselves. We have done 360s. 360s is where you give to your subordinates, your peers, your boss, and it rates you on a variety of different levels. And it tells you where your strengths are as a leader and where your weaknesses are. We have done that in Maricopa, not only myself, my entire executive team, but we've done that for the 110, what would be known as lieutenants or sergeants in a different organization. Everybody got one. But what I'm going to talk about is we also did that organizationally to see what was it and who were we. Now, I'm going to share something that I normally don't tell people because it's not very pleasant. When I was interviewed to get this job back in 2000, one of the questions that I had from the presiding judge was, please describe your leadership characteristics. In being who I am, I immediately said what I was. I'm a benevolent despot, and I really felt that that's exactly the best description of me. I care for my people very deeply. I care for this community, but I was also very much into being into control. I grew up, I said that, I didn't say when I started, but I was in private policing in 1975. Not many women in private policing, not many women anywhere in 1975 in the justice system. Our justice system was very autocratic. It was very top down. It was definitely by the books. It was chain of command. So I come by it pretty easily. And one of the things that I realized 5 years into being chief in Maricopa County, we got everything under control. There had been some things that were out of whack. We came back into balance in terms of we perhaps had gone too much into what I'll call the softer side, and our reputation with local law enforcement and the then county attorney was not very positive because we were seen too much as into redemption, and we needed to kind of get back in touch with our enforcement side and find balance. We did that, but all of a sudden after doing that, I had to really reflect, does that old style really work? And we spent a lot of time talking amongst ourselves, I spent time talking with my presiding judge, with the county manager, with the deputy county manager in charge of budget, but probably the most was talking to my own staff. And staff were basically saying, okay, here's what you need to start thinking about. Your style was very good. It got you where you wanted to be. It created a department, and it's totally in control now. Now you have to let go. All of a sudden, what I was actually hearing was something that we've probably heard either when we were teenagers, and we ourselves said it to our parents, or those of you who are currently parents, letting go, letting people succeed or fail in their own way, and empowering people. And one of the things, now having worked 3 years on what kind of leadership do I want to look like and be, this is what I truly believe I'm striving for. I haven't necessarily gotten there, but I'm striving for. And I think what's important is the first one, and why I'm driven, is you've got to have the integrity, that honesty, the integrity, sometimes defined as intestinal fortitude. But when you see something that's not right, you're willing to commandeer the change, and you have the courage. It's not easy sometimes getting up in front of people and basically saying, my belief in public safety is by promoting behavioral change. Sometimes it doesn't resonate well with my local law enforcement people. They kind of look at me until I'm able to do one-on-ones and say, okay, I got 60 people that report to me. Don't you think my job is to change their behavior? Yeah, I can do it in a variety of different ways, but that is what my fundamental job is. So recognizing that, also seeing what I just saw on the slides, that what the public is saying is they honestly believe that we need to reinvest in the front end of the system. And my definition of the front end of the system goes to the police so that CIT teams are not cut. You saw how much we're dealing with mental health, and yet CIT teams are being cut, even here in Phoenix, which has some of the best. So it's going to be important that we have a voice, that we talk about what needs to be done. Create a shared vision. I was deliberate in what I picked for my background on my PowerPoints. I think that's the fundamental. Somehow we have to have a vision. My organization is not as big as Director Ryan's, it's not as big as PPD, but we're almost 1,200. Now, we want to speak with one voice. We at least want to know what direction we're going in. So somehow, over the last 11 years, I've been attempting to create a shared vision with everyone, somehow resonating even with the most cantankerous person I might have in my staff, to figure out how to get him or her to be a part of what we're trying to do. So we've worked very hard to try and create this shared vision. And in creating a shared vision, it's important that you go to the last one, which is strong communication skills, because it's not just getting up in front of people and speaking. Where I'm still deficient, and I've been working on for all my life, is learning how to be an active listener. And listening, taking the ideas, and recognizing that executive management and mid-management doesn't necessarily have all the answers. The men and women doing the job probably have better ways of solving some of our problems. So in creating a shared vision, it's not just what is mine as the chief, it's what is ours as a department. So it's a two-way, and that includes decision-making. I've been in this business because I believe in it, so you have to be passionate. If you don't believe, and I tell all my new recruits coming through, that people can change, go do something else. You fundamentally got to believe that you can offer hope and that people can change. Otherwise, you're going to be miserable working in probation. Absolutely miserable. And I don't like negativity and people who are not happy. So it's going to be important that whoever the leader is, wherever that leadership is, that you're passionate and truly believe in what it is that we do. Understanding strategic planning and being data-driven, it's critical. I can tell you that that's what's really assisted our department. I'm not an elected official. I'm appointed by the presiding judge. I have some very good people who work with me. And probably more importantly, when I look to see what goes on, it's hard to compete with elected officials, whether it be Bill Montgomery or the sheriff, because they have a different bully pulpit. I don't have the same one. But what I have is data. And if the data is positive, it puts me on a level playing field. So we're very data-driven. Strategically, we attempt to know where we want to go. We are constantly looking at that. Every year we update our strategic plan, and we look at it. And I can say that during tough fiscal times, we eliminated programs based on what the data told us and had to reinvest someplace else. And we did that collectively with rank and file and with mid-management, but we did accomplish that. What I'm most proud of is the ability to develop a team. There's no I. It's a cliche in team. It is about we, and we do have a team. And one of the things that you saw up there for the P&P people, they were concerned about succession planning. I could leave tomorrow and you would have a good deputy chief be able to replace me, and I can say that with all honesty. So team building, recognizing that each one of us has different strengths and other areas of opportunity, and knowing what those may be, and putting those individuals where you may be lacking on your team is going to be critical. Empathetic and understanding. I can't say enough about that. At least understanding and recognizing some of the roles that other people and the concerns that other people have is really critical. The next one is something that I hadn't really thought about, because I've always kind of been bold and a major risk taker and kind of a defiant individual. You wouldn't want to have to supervise me. And what I learned is not everybody has the same makeup as Barbara. I had to create a safe environment so that people felt like they could take risks. We're not there yet, but we're certainly there a lot more than in the past. I have learned to back off, not to complete people's sentences as much as I used to. And I think part of what goes on is that it's so critical for those of us in positions of executive that we learn how to create a safe environment. We all made mistakes, and some of them might have been really big ones in our career. I'm not going to share any of those with you because I've done that. But I learned from my mistakes. I really didn't learn from my successes. I was proud of them, but I learned from my mistakes. We got to afford that same opportunity for our rank and file. And I already talked about communication skills. All right, I'm just going to get through this fast. You heard me say we did 360s for entire mid-management. We did executive leadership for all of us. We spent a lot of time talking to one another about what we wanted to change and how we wanted to change it up. But we also brought this thing called the Liger Organizational Climate Survey. And it basically says, I want to see where the organization is, and I want to go where the organization wants to take me. And it measures basically 6 dimensions: leadership, motivation, communication, decisions, goals, and controls. And it then breaks your organization into an exploitive authoritarian, the benevolent despot, moves to consultative, and then it moves to participatory. What I'm going to share with you is what my organization used to look like. Not in each one of the dimensions. We'd be here for a long time, and lunch is getting ready to be served. This was done so that the executive team, of which there are 17 of us, mid-management, which is there's 110, and then rank and file, which is roughly 800 individuals. And they rated those wonderful categories with the 19 items. And basically, initially I was happy, although I was sad, We didn't have any in the authoritarian piece, but as you can see, we had a lot in the benevolent, autocratic system. But remember what I said when I started to go into my own leadership style. I was that. And the question really became, if I was going to have my own personal renaissance, I needed to ensure that it was going to happen within the organization. Because probably what I was emulating from the top was exactly what my deputy chiefs were doing, in turn the bureau chiefs, in turn the supervising POs, right down to their POs. So one of the things we worked on for 2 years, we said to ourselves, where are the problems? And when you do the 19 questions, you really get some very good feedback on where the problems are. We created a whole lot of different things. We rethought how we were doing business. And then 2 years later, 2 years later, we're far more in the consultative. We still have places to go. And as you can see, we are investing primarily in ourselves, meaning the executive team, so that we truly were team. And then we are investing in our mid-management, and you can see the major movements that occurred there. In both of those arenas, we're almost in the consultative. Where we still have miles to go is with rank and file. We still have 6 in that category, but we are clearly moving into consultative. Now, does any of this make any sense, is probably what you're saying. And you're sitting there thinking, where is she going with this? Well, the reason I'm going there is when you start to look at shared decision-making, better communication, clearer understanding what goals and objectives and what the vision is, it does impact results. Is it the only thing? Absolutely not. But this is statewide. The Chief Justice has established protecting children, communities, and families. She has challenged us. Remember I said we all have the same offender screening tool? This was the charge in terms of really trying to send less people to corrections, making more people successful. That's our statewide data. Here's Maricopa County data. And I did it a little differently because I wanted to talk to you about how many lives we've actually saved. We actually now, in a 2-year process, 3,000 less people, 3,000 more people have successfully completed probation. Charles, 1,142 less have gone to DOC. And more importantly, 741 individuals did not commit a new felony crime. One last slide before lunch, because Scott Decker is going to kill me. I had a challenge actually from Charles Flanagan through Chuck Ryan that basically said to me, we want you to do a better job of people exiting our department with probation tails. And we have 120 of them a month coming out. Local law enforcement who work here in Maricopa, 120 are coming out a month. Look at that top number. Prior to the grant, 23% of the people being released from DOC to probation never showed. No shows. Gone with the wind. We put in a reentry grant. We now have people going into the facilities. We have reduced caseloads. They're actually working with people 120 days, and then they're stabilizing and they're moving to standard probation. That rate afterwards, 2.5%. And I could go on and on about, does it make a difference if you're in touch with your rank and file? Do they understand purpose? And I can be pretty proud that I believe the organizational development, the correctional leadership that we've invested in our mid-management, right on up to me, has made that difference. So I want to just thank you for the opportunity to do this presentation. Hopefully it's been enlightening. I was asked whether or not I could have John Hepburn learn something new, so I have to ask him if he has. But thank you for your time.
Very coherent